In this section, we'll look at the pressures and problems women faced in society just after World War II and in the 1950s. But first, we need to go back before World War II and look at women in that period. During the Great Depression, of course, the government and the economy encouraged women to be at home to keep jobs for the men. And the number of female workers was only about 25% of the workforce. The proportion of unionized female workers was only about 9%. Those who did work were usually young and single. When they got married, they generally stopped work, at least in the house. And those who worked generally worked in traditional female occupations, things like secretaries or nurses or elementary school teachers, the type of jobs that tended to pay less than the male dominated jobs. During the war, of course, there was no shortage of jobs, but rather a shortage of workers. And this was especially in the acute in the plants that were making the war goods, things like trucks and electronics, construction, all the things that would do the miracle of production. And women were acculturated not to do those jobs, and so the government had a vested interest in getting women into the factories and doing this heavy lifting. And what they did was they created a fictitious character, Rosie the Riveter, and Rosie would tell the women, yes, you can do it. And it stressed patriotism and encouraged women to enter these heavy industry labor jobs that were necessary to keep the war goods going. By and large, American women answered the call. At the end of the war, the percentage of women in the workforce was just about 40%. The number of unionized female workers had grown to 22%. Whereas before the war, women workers were young and single. After the war, 75% were married, 60% were over 35 years old, and a full third had children under the age of 14. Of course, they were no longer doing their traditionally female jobs, but they were doing the heavy lifting jobs that Rosie Riveter encouraged them to do. They would say famously, we're the Janes who make the planes. Now, the women were getting paid only two-thirds the salary of men, and this was despite government rules during the war requiring equal pay for equal work. But nevertheless, in many instances, the women were paid still more than they were doing the traditionally female jobs before the war. Moreover, when the women came home, of course, the men were at war, and if any problem arose, the women had to deal with it. If the car broke down, they had to get it fixed. They had to cut the lawn. They had to balance the checkbook and pay the bills. They had to deal with all the issues. And the result of this was that women had a sense of empowerment and a growing sense of independence that women had never experienced before the war. Of course, the government worried that when the war was over with, there wouldn't be enough jobs for the men and the nation might return to depression. So the government in the Rosie Riveter program still kept stressing that the female workers in these better paid industrial jobs was simply temporary. A War Department brochure read, quote, a woman is a substitute, like plastic instead of metal. A Labor Department brochure read, a woman's primary duty is to her family. Critics of women work had cited some of the new domestic problems. They saw rising rates of juvenile delinquency, claimed that it increased fivefold during the war. They complained of latchkey children, and they noted that the divorce rate had gone from 16 to 27%. So when the war was over, the culture began to encourage women to return to their traditional roles, return to the housewife and mother, and if they were going to work, return to their traditionally lower paying female jobs. Indeed, during the 1950s, the percentage of women working remained high, but once again they were working in the lower paid traditionally female jobs. In the post-war world in the 1950s, you can see the economy and society encouraging women to return to the home as mothers and wives, and if they're going to work in the traditionally lower paying female jobs. As a matter of fact, the number of women in the working outside the home actually didn't decrease after the war. In 1952, there were 2 million more women working than before the war, than during the war rather. But most of them returned to traditionally lower paying female jobs, which again this society encouraged them to do. You see this in so many ways. The overall the percentage of college students that were female in the 1950s was lower than in the 1920s, and almost 2/3 of the women in college actually failed to get a degree. Those who did often said they were looking for the MRS degree. In high school, girls were told to take typing, etiquette, cooking, while boys were told to take carpentry, auto mechanics, and our rigorous academic courses that might lead them into law or medicine. They would encourage women to go into things like home economics. A famous 1950 textbook on family planning declared, quote, "Men aren't interested in college degrees, but in the warmth and humanness of the girls they marry. Men still want wives who will bolster their egos rather than detract from them." Guidance counselors told girls to not miss the boat by pursuing higher education solely. A famous psychologist, Helena Deutsch, published a best-selling book, The Psychology of Women, in the 1950s. In her book, following kind of from Freud, she argued that women had an intensified personality, sort of a conflict between motherhood and eroticism. She said that this gave women a unique ability to identify with others. Among the things she said was that women would be happier in more submissive roles. Now, her work was complex and in some ways foretold the women's rights movement, but the culture seemed to take it as she was telling women that happiness was found by being submissive. The new medium of television emphasized women's role as the submissive housewife, and it was the father's role to lead the family. You see shows like Father Knows Best. Generally, the media portrayed women in one of three ways. Common was women as the saccharine sweet housewife, the pretty girl next door, so sweet. You see this, for example, on the Donna Reed show or Ozzie and Harriet. Then you can see women as the incompetent, zany madcaps, like the popular hit in the 1950s, I Love Lucy, not capable of any form of independence. If women were depicted in other ways, it was probably that as sex objects, sex symbols, and this, of course, is best exemplified by the starlet Marilyn Monroe in the 1950s. Following the cultural trends, the women largely returned home, and you see the baby boom taking place. The fertility rate, the number of births per 1,000 women, rose from 80 just before the war to 127 in 1957. When American baby was born every 7 seconds. This was the baby boom, and of course baby boom takes raising a baby and child takes a lot of time, and that sort of kept women from higher professions or better paying jobs. Books such as Dr. Benjamin Spock's 1950s bestseller Baby and House Care stress the importance of the mother's full-time devotion to child rearing for the emotional health of the child. Society continued to stress sort of a double standard in its culture. Women were expected to be virgins at the time of marriage, while at the same time men were not. Laws often differentiated between men and women in ways that did not favor the women. In many respects, the 1950s, it was a man's world. The women, however, they had had a taste of independence with Rosie the Riveter in the 1940s during the war, and this is going to show them that they are capable of more, and thus this laid the foundation for the modern women's rights movement. This includes the section on the how the culture and society and economy in the 1940s and 1950s sort of laid the foundation for the women's rights movement.